Welcome to Mind Meld, a podcast brought to you by Maz and Iman, a stream of consciousness, conversational style podcast with visionaries building the future of Web3. No topics are off limits. Okay, well, thank you for joining us, Michael. I feel like this is something that has been in the making for a pretty long time.
I love it.
Every single one of our Zoom calls and chats has been super inspiring, helped us a lot with our decision making in terms of what we're building. And yeah, if we could just even open source any of those Zoom calls, it would just be like super helpful for everyone. I feel.
It's
But
always been fun. It's good to work. It's good to just hang with good people. So working on good things, and it's it's always pretty special. So I'm always appreciative.
yeah, absolutely. So Michael, I think we try to set these like settings at the very beginning to kind of really understand the person behind all the ideas and what makes them tick, and I guess how their journey kind of evolved into this. We really believe that you're one of the most active and influential builders and investors in the Web3 space, and the industry knowledge that you have around system design thinking, capital, community, and coordination. All of these like new types of mechanisms can really, I guess, from your insight, provide a lot of help to bring light to so many other kind of key areas or problem areas that a lot of builders and everyone is trying to solve in the space. So without further ado, would love to hear a little bit more about your background and how you came to be in these positions that you're in today.
A lot of pain. Probably the best way to say it. No, I've always been from early on really just interested in how systems work, and not necessarily just from a technical perspective, but just from a social and civilizational level. And it's always been fascinating for me to look for patterns in things. And so early on, I started out. I didn't really know which direction to go, but I loved the idea of venture, and venture just broadly as a concept of risking or daring, undertaking or journey, right? That opportunity to come together with people and build something, create something new that didn't exist, that is trying to do something differently. And for me, differently very much meant in a way that fits with that systems level view of things, of like, how does this world actually work and how could we tweak it to be better in some way? And so for me, I've always seen venture as one of our most useful tools or powerful tools potentially to be able to do that, to do things that policy isn't ready to jump in on, or things that movements can't quite activate yet. And it plays a unique role in that. So that's how I've always viewed venture. And I started out early in design. It was actually a t-shirt company out of university, just kind of as a fun thing. But quickly saw that two people who joined us were incredibly talented on the design and creative side. And so that turned into a design company and really kind of landed my appreciation for good quality design and the role that design plays in thinking about and seeing and introducing people to a different kind of world. So design really landed for me as important in that. And then I later on went into the early days of the internet, but got really fascinated by what was happening with the internet and intranets for a while as well at the very beginning. And that's what landed me in the technology side of it, in that early phase of the first internet. I actually remember somebody, I have two moments, I'll just share these. These will totally out my age, but I have two moments that I remember technically that I was a total idiot on. One was a person who said, "Hey, I got to show you this HTML. You got to understand what HTML is doing. And you're just going to learn. It's super simple, but it's going to be amazing." And I looked at it and went, "That's stupid." The other one was another person said, "Oh, JavaScript, that's amazing. Like, it is so cool. It is so much, you can do so much with it." I'm like, who would want to build on JavaScript? So I may not be as foresight oriented on the technologies that underpin. So maybe I'm slightly late to the game, but uh, anyway, that's kind of how I've been rolling with some of these things. So anyway, then I ended up going deep after the design stuff. Went deep into clean tech. Founded a company around thermal energy that got acquired. Was in venture capital for a while on the renewable energy side, and again, that would fascinate me about clean tech and renewables was just the intersection of how humans, like, energy is so fundamental, and it ties into ecology and it ties into society. So it was another one of those things that's really deeply interwoven. And then veered off into social finance. At the time, it was just before impact investing got started, and got deep into thinking about capital as a way of influencing those systems and societies towards better outcomes. And that's kind of because I see these patterns of things that are starting to come together, and spent a fair bit of time really trying to move forward the impact investing ecosystem. And that took me deeper into going, well, what are actually, like, how do we move systems as a whole forward? How do we think about systems in an interconnected way? What are the different tools, whether it be technology, design, movements, policy, to be able to actually influence and change society? And underlying all that was recognizing the increasing pressures of climate and inequality and everything that falls out from those two things as being fundamental existential risks that we're facing, and trying to think about, well, how do we actually collectively or individually and in small groups intentionally try and shift this context, shift the things to whatever is next. And I mean, I think what I find most interesting in it is, like, these existential risks are unavoidable and they're accelerating and we're moving faster and faster towards them. They're not things that we can choose to ignore. They're not what if scenarios, but they're creating this context that everything is going to have to change. Either that or we're all hosed and everything collapses and we have mass amounts of chaos. And it's a continuum. I mean, there's going to be lots of chaos and there's going to be some question of how much and who does it impact most. But if we think and recognize that this kind of change is happening, often accelerated by technical innovation, the foundational pillars of how change and evolution happens, then we're kind of left in this position of, well, it is all changing. It's not like incremental progress is the most useful thing. We've got these tools of capital. We've got these tools of movement building. We've got these tools of technology. How do we coordinate them and assemble them into the best way possible? And what's the right scale? And how do those scales all interconnect? And that's the fascinating, chaotic project of what I get drawn into. And that's kind of, I think, what landed me back in Web3, really, in this recent round, as saying, this is the place that I think we have an absolutely unique opportunity to create new foundations for whatever's ahead of us. Had some other stuff along the way, but I'll stop there.
So many good stuff. I love that you just kind of gave the summary. We don't even need to do a voiceover for this pod. That is what we're going to talk about today. And super excited. I think one of the things that we've always appreciated about our conversations is it is looking at so many different layers of it. And when you mention the thermal energy, that level of systems understanding to be able to construct a technology and pilot it and make it happen in the real world of atoms outside the digital, there is some level of, I guess, huge advantage of having those different perspectives and being able to apply that to all these new problems and coordination and capital allocation challenges that we face. Because it's going to be a rough 10 years and we can be rosy about it or we can be pessimistic about it. But in the end, we've already had a lot of symptoms in the world because of our cascading failures across different systems. And I think regardless of where this ends up, we need to find a way to both mitigate the shit that's going to happen and make sure that we recover from it while speeding up development in all the areas that we need to avoid the symptoms of climate change, depression, and the list goes on. So excited to jam on that, and maybe to jump right into it now that we're talking about systems, and that's what we love talking about, getting into the complex interdependent problems that we need to solve. Which of the areas that you've worked across or have kind of had access to seeing what's going on are you interested in solving at the moment? And what do you think is the most important problems to be solving at the moment across things like climate change, coordination, being able to kind of get out of this value extractive system that we're in that basically leaves the market in control of where humans are trying to coordinate towards? What are some of those thoughts there, and hopefully tie in all the stories that you mentioned throughout the intro?
Wow. I mean, I think where I'm at right now is that the most, what will make the most difference, and it's not like it's happening. I think it's a natural evolution of, like, it's a natural evolution, is that technology and the technologies that are emerging now are enabling a new coordination infrastructure for civilization that is interconnected with nature. And so I keep coming back to civilizational scale, and a lot of people kind of get glazed over when you bring up that level, but it brings up that this is really about all of us as interdependent, and interdependent not just with humanity, but as part of a bigger ecology and a bigger universe and a bigger reality and existence. And nature is very good at coordinating, extremely good at coordinating. It's just us who don't necessarily like how it coordinates. We're the ones that suck at coordinating. And so I think what's actually happening is there's some great reads on thinking about technology as nature and as part of natural evolution. And I think that's a much better way to understand this technology, not as a force of human creation and a tool for us to do things, but it's an inevitable, and it's weaving its way into outside of our intentional control in ways that we can influence and we can direct it. But that's a path that's happening as a part of a larger process. And it's going to more mimic how nature coordinates itself. So when we start seeing, like, people recognizing mycelial networks and looking to natural patterns of organization, we don't see these siloed entities and structures that we think of as, here's our best process and tools for organizing and coordinating humans. Nature kind of chuckled, like if nature was a human, it would chuckle at us as you little fools, right? This is like, we're going to a whole order of complexity and potential interdependent, like nuanced coordination that is going to allow us to be much more in sync with everything else around us. And that, to me, is everything right now. Without that coordinating layer, and there's lots of examples in history around just human civilizations, and it's been our coordinating capacity, our coordinating infrastructures and technologies that have allowed our civilizations either to make it through to a new level of complexity or collapse and become irrelevant. And we're in one of those phases again. So to me, this is where I've landed in, is like coordination is absolutely critical to this, and it's the game that we're playing as a whole. So that's the number one piece that I'm really interested in. And then the other side inherent in that is it has to be in a way that is interdependent with nature and the environments and natural processes and systems. That's kind of obvious to me. And that's much more dynamic than just a new tech that does this, like it's about solar panels, or it's about fission, or it's about whatever it is we want to do. Like those are all just part of the context. And then the other piece is around the humans, is what is our role, and how do we design, and how do we adapt to this new coordinating layer in a way that fits with everybody and fits with humans, and humans not as this, like, humans as part of the natural environment, humans as part of the world, humans as who they are, and not this, like, that we are this super higher level order of organism that is in control of everything, because that's a joke. But in that, it means, like, really understanding what it is to be human and how humans can thrive in this ecosystem. And that gets right into what I think is at the core of, like, if we don't solve equity, and if we don't solve the ways that we divide and destroy ourselves, then we're never going to really thrive as part of this broader environment. So all those areas are kind of open to me, and I don't like to go into necessarily specifics around individual pieces, but, like, that's the overall playground, and then whatever shows up is what I get interested in.
Yeah, love that. And when I think of what is the most, like, leverage point for us individually and as a collective to focus our efforts on, it does come back to being that coordination problem, because it cascades into so many of the other problems, because it is such a symbiotic problem to solve when you're thinking of what is the best solution, whether if it's on the energy side and combining some kind of micro nuclear with solar and a lot of batteries, all the way to kind of what are the policies needed to help solve this problem, to provide subsidies, to provide some kind of incentives for consumers and businesses to adopt this when it has a lower cost in the interim, especially for developing countries. So there's so many layers of this problem to look at. And when you're trying to do that all in 10 years, we could just kind of focus on one area and hope that's the thing that gets us there. And that's the nice part of having so many people and the rise of DAOs, is it gives so much ability at the work, at the grassroots, at the kind of labor level. And it almost brings back power to labor in a way where it has for so long been towards the capital and obviously the organization structures that we've constructed across politics and companies. So lots to dissect there. But one thing that spoke out when you were mentioning the whole nature is coordinating us, and we need to figure out how to coordinate with it in a way. What's something that is getting you excited about, like, the solutions we're solving around coordination? And since we've started at this middle point between the physical and digital worlds, what are some interesting kind of coordination primitives, tools, or things that you're seeing on the ground being applied that excite you?
Oh man, there's so many things to dive into. It's like, I'll say actually right off the bat, that's kind of why I love our conversation so much, is because of what you're building, getting into, like, you're fundamentally getting into the composability of creation, like, of how humans create, and thinking about it in a way that allows that. It's like a substrate, right? It's a ecological substrate of what you're ecological substrate for human coordination that I see that you're building with CrowdMuse and the intention with which you're going. And so, like, that's like that bit, whether we talk about it as supply chains or whether we talk about it, like, that's what I see that you're playing with and working towards. And there's a depth of care and nuance that I think is really interesting to explore within that. So that's one area that I love it. And some people might lump that into supply chains, but that's how I think about this kind of stuff. It's supply chains is a really crude industrial way of thinking about it, but it's really about the composability of creation. So that's one area that I absolutely love. I've gone super deep with Krause House because sport also is an incredible vector to explore the application of these technologies and approaches, because sport speaks to humans and society and culture in a way that is really unique. It is almost universal. People love to play, whether they consider themselves fans of sport or participants in sport or not. The same energy of that underlying aspect of human dynamic cooperation, coordination, challenge, all that comes into sport. The idea of beliefs and belongings is very transparent and out there in sport, and it creates a surface area to experiment with these things in ways that are not as confrontational or not as seriously confrontational as things like they might be within politics, policy, or other areas of society. So Krause House has been, like, from the beginning for me, the crew that understood that right from the beginning, understood that decentralization of ownership of an NBA team using a DAO, really like using a DAO to go buy an NBA team, is really about decentralizing ownership, but more broadly coordinating people to make sport what they want it to be, is an incredibly exciting area to play with. And what comes up for me in that too is that there's a pattern that I'm starting to see. Like, I think actually what Krause House is doing, the way Krause House is going, will be replicated across just about every complex sector in some way, because you can address a whole system. This goes back to something that you mentioned earlier, is like, what's the right way to approach it? And you can't you can't just go with one organization, our old idea of an organization. I'm going to go fix a sector. Like, that just doesn't happen. One policy, that's not going to fix a sector. So DAOs offer this new form of coordination that allows us to get at sector scale. So that's what I think Krause House is doing, is a pattern that might be able to be replicated. But what's important in each of these things, it's not about the DAO or that collective of people being the magical ones to have changed something. It's they're showing up in the context of change that's already underway, right? So sport is a perfect example again of that. Is it grew up, professional sport anyway, grew up in this era of broadcast, right? So, hey, we've got this great exciting play and game that plays every once in a while, and we'll be able to broadcast that to as many people as possible. And then those people, those broadcast channels will sell advertising, will make money through that. So it's a very linear, old school industrial process kind of way of sport. But as we see with the type of sport and opportunities for fan engagement on all our digital coordination technologies and media and everything like that, it's all being reinvented anyway. And so in that context comes the opportunity to introduce, hey, we've got a few new underlying mechanisms and infrastructures that can allow us to do this better, allow us to engage more people, to be more creative, to make it better for everyone in that ecosystem in a way that's aligned for all of them. I mean, it seems completely obvious when you start thinking about it that way. So that's why I love sport and what Krause House is doing as a start point to be able to do that. But I think we're going to see that across all kinds of other industries and sectors.
Yeah, that's so exciting. There is, yeah, I mean, on the kind of, we do talk a lot about what is this like Trojan horse that would then onboard not just obviously early adopters of whatever this new tech thing is that we think is going to create that coordination, ownership, and like incentive for people to adopt. And sometimes it could be like seen as like a very well branded hardware device like Ledger, making it in as like the Apple that would then onboard consumers of like security and privacy over their digital currencies, let's say. And then the sports side, obviously, from an identity standpoint and a culture standpoint, is so spot on. Um, was it like in 2020? Was it? It was So Rare, that was the French company that started the football NFTs, and it felt like that could have been the one that really brought sports NFTs anyway, into the kind of like consumer mindset of like what NFTs could enable.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about the way you guys are doing it is it's very kind of like community first or community driven, and then the other components of coordination, capital, etc., has been slowly like induced into it over time to then bring you to your roadmap of like being able to actually part own an NBA team, which is fascinating. And obviously that has taken a really long time to get here, right? And so the recent post that you guys just came out with the other day about like open source ownership, like would really like to dissect that, because
Yeah.
from the idea of like product, well, ideation to discovery and then implementation, with all the other things underneath it, like the legal side, the
Yeah.
finance side, everything. Dissecting that down a little bit would be interesting to learn more.
Yeah. Happy to do that. Maybe I'll just start. Like, I think that one point that I'll start with on it is, in technology, when we build technological solutions, we often are solving very discrete, defined problems, which is good and natural. But as we enter into working with established social regulatory systems, there's a lot more complexity that's there. And so the mindsets are different in how you approach it and how you engage. But this is where, like, Krause House has understood this from the beginning, is that this is not something that is about, hey, let's just do a crowd fund, get a bunch of degens to buy some NFTs, and then we'll be able to buy an NBA team. I mean, that's not realistic, and it never was the plan, because it recognizes that leagues have been created and teams are governed. They're very intricate governance processes that have been refined over time to create value in the ecosystem that they are a part of. And so you're not going to go in with a technological fix. You're not going to go in with just a bunch of capital and change anything. So what does it mean to engage with that kind of a system? It means coming at it from like the fundamentals of what this thing is about, right? So, and you'll see that in the post, that the conversations with owners reflect what actually matters about what it is that they're doing and the teams that they're creating and what that experience is for fans. And helping owners, or sitting with owners to have those kinds of conversations, it works when their owners are seeing it. They're seeing this innovation coming. They're seeing these opportunities. They love and experience the game. They get what the opportunities ahead of them are, and they get where the value is going to grow from doing more of that kind of stuff. And so the value proposition that they get from Krause House is not like a private equity firm of, here, we're going to give you money. And it's not it's not from, oh, hey, we're going to consult with you and do this sort of stuff. It's, we come as a community, the ability, like we say it as, the community is our superpower. And if you've got a fan base of millions of fans, in that talent network is the most incredible set of creativity and opportunity that is desperately wanting to be a part of and help contribute. And that's a coordination challenge, right? And it's not about, oh, hey, we're going to let everybody ship in their shitty ideas into something, but it's about, how do you coordinate that network to create, like, to co-create the most incredible experience around that team, that brand, everything to do with it. And when you start to think about it that way, there's no part about owning, managing, operating a team that can't be improved by good ideas executed well. And so that's really what a DAO can show up as, is this coordination mechanism that gives you basically unlimited resources and capabilities to build a better whatever it is you're trying to build.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you brought up that communities enabled by this technology can pool money and resources. And I think most people forget that the coordination of those resources is going to be the biggest unlock for us, because this is the first time we've been able to almost have ownership over something, where if we pool our money, resources, time, networks, we see some kind of value that comes back to us. And so when you look at ownership and community, those two things go hand in hand in such a beautiful way. So I think Krause House gives us that example to talk about, this community is what we're bringing together, and that is what is going to help as a group of people that have this set vision problem solve along the way and allocate this shared pool of resources towards solving that problem together. How do you see ownership? Oh yeah, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, it's exactly. Ownership is like the other thing is it really gives a good opportunity to do is like an MBA team, as an example, is a multi-billion-dollar asset, right? And so one, we're not just going to pool $3 billion from a bunch of people on the internet to buy a team. Two, the league won't allow that. And three, that creates the context to say, well, what else? What does this actually mean? What does ownership actually mean? What is the role of community in this? And so ownership very quickly gets unbundled into economic participation, into governance and authority, and access into the experience, right? Access into that asset, access to be able to participate in it in certain ways. Conventionally, and we can see this across just about every organizational structure, it's not unbundled. Everything's like crammed into one single limited constrained thing that everybody fights for. But having conversations with team owners is really easy to go, oh yeah, well, there's all these different aspects across each of those dimensions that we could open up and create huge value. So ability to have like a conversation with a player after an event, right? That itself, that's an aspect of access, right? Being able to get into that kind of a context or experience. How can you enable that for people? What is the value of that? How much do people value that? Massively, right? It's completely locked right now. How do you bring in specific forms of governance around very specific, around high context decisions or sub aspects of operations in a team? You can't do that right now. It's all within the construct of the individual organization. But why can't you bring in expert pools, well coordinated, to help advise and participate in certain aspects of decision making? Crypto allows us to do that very, very effectively, right? And so all of these things start to really, like, as we get deeper and deeper into it, we start to go, oh, wait a minute, why couldn't we do this? And the reasons we aren't is simply because we've had these siloed organizational structures that have very limited resources, and so they just try and contain it all inside. But why? A team that is super active in the community, they have so many touch points in their local community. The value of that brand, the value of the voice of those athletes, the value of how they show up in their local community is massive. How do you, what's their role? What's their opportunity with that? How can you engage community to be more proactive around that intangible value that they have, that influence that they have in the community? Who knows? But that's completely untapped territory for engaging fans with well-designed governance and mechanisms to do that. So many opportunities.
Yeah, and on a kind of like from a multi-sided perspective, obviously you have the fans and then you have the players from the two-sided perspective, let's say. What are the fun things or the interesting things that these fans have been saying from like an act? Because I'd be so intrigued to see like what is it that they want more access to, right?
There's a great documentary. So the Krause House bought the Ball Hogs last year and ran the first season, and Uncle John is one of the community members who came in early last year, I think it was. And he ended up becoming the CEO of the Ball Hogs because he was just such a passionate community person. And there's a really great documentary, a 10-minute documentary it's the Uncle John story. And it goes through like him being the CEO of the Ball Hogs and doing the fan engagement and what it means. But what's important about it, and this is like I keep coming back to, is it's about the sense, I think he described it as people want to belong, right? They want to feel less lonely. And that's what sports brings. That's what fandom brings to people. And you can start when you land that, like often people go like, yeah, like I just, that's why I'm a part of my team. That's why I'm a fan of this team. That's why I'm excited about it. You start to see patterns of it everywhere. So take the Green Bay Packers or take even the Celtics when they had public shares. Like, yes, that's economic ownership. Well, no, not really. Like, people are getting a certificate basically says that they're an owner. They don't really care about the economic value of that. They feel a part of it, right? They feel like I'm special because I'm a part of this thing in this way. And that, to me, right there is the magic of what ownership means. Is how do we feel that we as a person belong to this thing? And so that's at the core of every single experience that I start to see that resonates with people, is they feel a part of it. Oh, my opinion, my idea got heard. Oh, I got a special jersey, right? That was a moment, an event in time. Oh, I got this digital avatar that represents me, but it's wearing the jersey. Like, whatever those, they're being a part of it. And that is the fundamental human condition, the human tap that this underlying technology enables.
Yeah, and that kind of like bundling and unbundling thing that you were like alluding
Yes.
to, like obviously, like, having spent a bit of time in VC as well, we used to love using that word, right? But we were using that word predominantly around like kind of the market or product propositions that would like target one specific target market, and then maybe like not necessarily, and then unbundle into like more segments of that target market. But the interesting thing about like how you could bundle and unbundle things via a like a Web3 standpoint is a slightly different thing, right?
It's hugely different. Like, this is what breaks all the models. It's what breaks everything. Like, and even with me being like as abstract as I am being, it's intentional, because we want to lock into a defined scope of understanding, right? And when we talk about something like Krause House, like, oh, it's a DAO, and we immediately start thinking about it like an entity or this little container. And as soon as we do that, we miss it. Like, we miss what the real opportunity, we miss what's really happening, because those subtle patterns and assumptions about there being a boundary around us and who we're connected with and what's in and what's out is exactly what this technology obliterates ultimately, right? So thinking about it, like, and it's like, hey, if I'm a fan of a team, great. A team is thinking about, that's my fan. But that's not like, that's a really limiting scope of what is the value about my relationship with that fan. They're also a fan of probably another team, or in another sport, or their kids play the sport as well. Like, whatever that is, there's so many ways that this stuff connects and branches. And until we understand and start thinking about that, we're not understanding how value flows through the ecosystem and the role that we could potentially play in enabling that. So this idea of composability, of governance, of participation, is really kind of messing with how to think about it as an investment, how to think about these things as an entity or organization, how to think about it as a technology even. Because these are these dynamic networks. And the biggest shifts, like, especially when we get back to this transformation lens, if we're talking about systems that are themselves going through a massive fundamental pivot in how they're structured and organized, to assume that we know what that's going to be is really, really kind of hard. And how, though, do we position ourselves to be able to be as valuable in that future shift, and part of that future shift is hard to think about and rationalize, because it's very dynamic and emergent.
Yeah. And honestly, you're doing almost three things at once, where on one side, it's understanding the system as it was, whether it's an industry problem or something else that you're looking at to solve. Once you understand that system, then you can use these new flexible organization containers that help distribute value in different ways, and introduces almost several primitives that let you shift the typical model that is, there's venture investment that takes on a lot of risk and then gets majority of the upside, all the way to more like decentralized version where there's a bunch of people coming in to share that risk across capital, coordination, community. and how do you construct a system of layers that can help allocate to solve the system that you're trying to solve. So it's just like this, like in my head 4D structure, and I'm trying to verbalize it. And the beauty of this is we're not going to get it right, and there is some value in ideating and brainstorming. There's a lot of value in being very aware that we're basically setting and creating cascade consequences of the decisions we're making now.
Yep.
And that's why it is nice that at least in Web3 there is this shared vision of abundance. And we've talked about how abundance can be abused, but just by saying like, oh, this is this utopic coercion, get everyone to believe in this. But when it comes down to ownership in the end of using all these tools to give ownership a little bit more distributed and allocated to the right people to help drive solving a problem. You mentioned ownership in different ways. Obviously, it's governance, having a say in what you're doing. There's economic rights. There's also just being able to associate to a sense of community. There's all the boring legal stuff as well that's going to be more and more important. But how are you looking across these different things, across governance, across economic rights, across the legal wrappers that help us construct these money Legos? What are the things that you're seeing, and where is there value in kind of solving in a more collaborative way these things that are ultimately the source of friction right now into us building better systems?
I think one of the biggest frictions is we just in SuperBenefit, which is a initiative that's been exploring this kind of stuff. One of the things that we observed is that entity thinking is one of the biggest breakpoints in actually being able to pursue Web3 to its fullest potential. And there's a natural, like, it's so baked into us that if we want to do something, wrap an entity around it. And once you have an entity around it, there's a clear boundary between what's in and what's out. And that is, that simple mindset, and go back to Krause House quickly as a really good example of this. Krause House was very intentional about saying we are a community and we have a very flat governance system that has all sorts of limitations to it. But the ability for any community member to bring forward a proposal into this treasury to request something is fundamental to the emergent properties of a system. And to be able to work and at a scale that is much broader than any entity could rationally consider engaging with. And that is the start point. I think community, and like we keep saying, community is our greatest asset. Community is a superpower because specifically community is super scalable, right? In terms of you can create, if you design for it, you can create that surface area that anybody who's drawn to it can find a way to participate. And if you do that and you think about it as, hey, if we get good at being able to resource the best ideas that emerge in that system, you have something that is way more capable than any organization could ever be. So a couple quick examples around that. One was the creation of the NFT NYC event that Krause House did last year, which was this 3-day tournament. It was like 3-day event, which was absolutely exceptional. It was something that came together in 60 days, entirely sourced and created within the community out of just self-motivated interest of some individuals who then came to the community, requested resources, and executed. And they executed this world-class event in 60 days that is just like, it's incomprehensible, right? There is no capacity in the DAO to do that, as if you think about it as an entity, and it should never really take that on because not resourced or capable of doing that. But community members showed up to do that. Another example is, as a community, like Krause House was in a way competing against massive private equity funds, right? And so how does a community that raised 5 million through a crowd fund compete against private equity funds? You don't compete. But you can also say, well, why couldn't we create our own private equity fund? And so the thinking in this, like if you come at it from a community first that has good coordination capabilities, is there's nothing you can't do. If the community decides to do it, there's no reason you can't go ahead and create it yourself, as long as that is able to run in parallel. And that is like the biggest shift in understanding and shifting it. So that's the one thing from the start point on the community. On the abundance side, we described it in SuperBenefit as universal abundance, and there's 4 principles four things that we identified within that that really continue to resonate with me. But the biggest limitation, and I think it's inherent in the coordinating principles and technologies, but the entity thinking is, I think, what limits our ability to enact them, because what happens is we always come down when we're executing, we come down to a lower level of scope and scale, and then we start making trade-offs, and we start thinking in the scope of that smaller scale in a way that's not about interconnected and interdependent with this broader ecosystem. I'm shipping a product, I'm trying to do this. This is the impact that I'm going to see, and I can't address all these other things. And it's not about having to address all the other things, but it's about being able to understand the connection in the broader ecosystem, and how do we optimize the things that we're creating that fits with those broader outcomes. And that is a simple, subtle shift in thinking, but it is absolutely critical for us to being able to allow the inherent potential of this technology to be realized in ways that are optimized for the most number of people. And not just for the most number of people, but for the best kinds of outcomes that we could imagine for that system. Because the best kinds of outcomes will always be the ones that include and benefit the most number of stakeholders. Always.
Within that, what are some of the so understanding it from kind of like external factors that are challenging, and that cause limitations and maybe potentially mindsets, but like how any idea essentially comes into fruition because it was the right time for it, led by market, led by culture, or led by whatever shift it may be.
Yeah.
Internally though, because Krause House is definitely a couple of, or a lot of steps ahead other than a few other maybe more emerging DAOs or smaller DAOs, or even if they're not even legal structured DAOs, calling themselves DAOs as like micro communities that have a certain objective that they want to achieve. And that kind of growth scale that you guys have had has been pretty rapid and exponential over the past year or so. Within that, though, what are the challenges that you saw kind of in phase 1, and then now this kind of next phase that you're in? Any future ones that you're also seeing as barriers that would potentially cause some form of an impact internally for the growth of this or the scalability of this, let's say?
I really think it's all coordination and mindset issues. I mean, which that's kind of, in a way, it's useless to say that, because that's everything is coordination and mindset issues. But I think it really matters for a DAO. And when there's pressure or tension, we can reach back for old paradigms, right? Reach back for old structures that made sense or were better understood or were proven in the past. And the problem with that, and it's not to say that that isn't useful, but the problem with it is it brings a lot of unintended consequences and baggage with it, right? So again, this for me, it just I'm just realizing that it keeps coming back to this, is as soon as there's a flip to we are, and people can, this can happen with saying we are a community, that can almost be the same as an entity, like that entity thinking, to think it's like we have this defined boundary and it's about us, it's about those who are inside this thing. As soon as that sets in, then it's inward looking, and it becomes this like it sets up these competitive dynamics within a resource constrained organization. And so what that usually leads to is the scope of ambition gets super small or becomes absolutely unrealistic, and all the trade-offs start to land. But if we can stay really focused on how do we enable the coordinating primitives for this broader system that could look like this in the future, if we actually, or we aspire to it looking like this in the future, that creates the space for all kinds of activity to happen and the boundaries to stay really permeable within that system. So it's hard to articulate that in how do you action that effectively within DAOs that are forming or within communities that are trying to accomplish something. But the patterns or the signs to look for are this sense of inside and outside. If you're feeling that, or feeling constraints around resources and limitations of capabilities, of resources also being talent, resources being capital, resources being anything else. Those are like coordination questions and vision mission questions, because that top level of the vision mission is what can bring people in, and the coordination is what can make it possible and allow it to happen in parallel. But we collapse it usually down to there and say, do we have enough resources to execute this very specific strategy to achieve this outcome? And that's also the challenge when engaging with venture capital often, right? Venture capital models, particularly venture capital models, not early stage capital, not just like, there's all kinds of ways to mobilize early capital, but conventional venture capital models push and encourage that really small compartmentalization.
Absolutely. And I love that we ended on venture capital, because this is something that we've spoken a lot about. This is basically a funding primitive that was established at some point. I don't know exact dates. That's one thing we say on this podcast. We don't do dates because we don't necessarily have the best memory, but we'll add it to the show notes. But as you mentioned, that we've had so many evolutions of investment vehicles, from commons to venture to private equity, ICOs, NFTs, Nouns DAO. I was talking to someone from the Ocean Summit this past week in Portugal, and trying to see how they're thinking of investment into marine, basically a DAO, and we'll link it. I think it's called Neo Atlantis. Yeah. And they're kind of looking across the, I guess, MRV side of being able to track the health of ocean life in many different gradients. And we were just chatting about how when you bring in asset-backed projects or systems that you want to address, how do you create both value flow into the system, and then how do you coordinate to make sure that you're allocating that capital in a way that's solving the problem in the most efficient way? And you see that everyone's looking at these different funding vehicles first as a way to bring in that value, because it's still a kind of market product fit conundrum where you're trying to say, like, look, your money allocation is best spent here, when it's such a difficult problem to solve. And it's so hard, especially for those types of impact investing or constructive investing, whatever the terms are, because it's hard to give the venture scale returns. So it makes you wonder, what is the best vehicle for these types of things? And we jokingly talked about bringing some level of predictive market combined with some kind of betting thing to make it so that if this coral health increases over time, someone can bet against it the same way you would bet against those influencers now boxing each other for I guess, attention. So just a lot of words said, but what's the thought that sparks when you think about the evolution of investment vehicles?
Yeah, it goes very much like I will always come back to how would a natural system do it? And it's not a mechanism, right? There will never be a mechanism. And I think this is where we get really caught up, is trying to find what is the mechanism, what is the thing that which it goes right back into entity thinking. It's like, what is the thing? And as soon as we go, what is the thing, we often either over engineer it, or we get stuck in like some some old practice that may work. And that's not to say to dismiss or disregard those things, but to use what we have available in whatever way is going to work to get us to this next phase, and recognize that what we do now is not necessarily what we need to keep doing in 6 months from now, in a year from now, in 5 years from now. And in fact, if we're thinking that it's going to be, if we're trying to solve for the forever thing, we're screwed, because there's no way we can understand, or the approach that we're going to envision is going to be the right thing to be adopted right now. There's so many variables and conditions in that. So I like to think about it as like, let's just put the pieces in place that make it easiest to get to this next step while we are trying to solve and learn from doing that. And given that there's so much more flexibility and creative potential around how we create new funding primitives, how we create new incentive mechanisms, how we weave all these things together, and given that our things are going to have to be interdependent with this broader ecosystem, like thinking about like, let's just get the simplest thing done next, and then find about, oh, this piece would fit really well, and it's not quite ready, but that's okay. So let's park that for a while, and then let's do that later. In the interim, let's do this, right? And thinking about it as a really composable future that we are trying to, that we are a part of, and we are trying to create. And in practical terms, I think that, like, I'm a big fan of using really simple existing legal structures that exist, to using designing protocols and integrating protocols where it makes sense. And I think we're going to see this future where we have really small, tiny little protocols that get plugged in, serving a very specific function. So something like Krause House as a DAO that's working at kind of at a sector scale could actually have launched a dozen protocols that coordinate different aspects of the system that are all out there operating interdependently. And I think that's the kind of future that we're going to see. And getting there is like, let's not overcomplicate this next step. Let's pick the simplest thing that people understand and will work for them, but know that that's just a partial solution, and let's just keep going.
I like that, because like that's basically what public assembly mentions, something around like build things that are missing or create things that are missing, right? Rather than adding more to the complexities or the noises, just build the thing that's missing and then plug it into the other thing that is doing the other thing, and then the other thing. But the thing is, I feel like even in blockchain, and even in our, like, I guess in this very somewhat niche circle, this conversation of interoperability and like integration and not working inside. I mean, we have also been talking about this for a really long time and not necessarily executing the things that we've been saying, right? I mean, which happens in every industry though, right? I mean, it's one of the things that if it's difficult to execute, you can complain about it, but at the end of the day, it's about literally just doing it. So essentially what you're saying. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think breaking it apart into smaller pieces again, right? Like we get so stuck in like it's hard. It's hard to do this stuff, but we get stuck into trying to build the perfect solutions, and attached to old ideas and models that may have benefits, and then we try and force fit them into this existing world or to what's coming. And I don't know. I think it could be a little bit easier. We can be a little bit nicer on ourselves.
Really, that makes sense. So what are you like? Because I know as a vision person, I'm really excited to kind of get into your head a little bit to see, like, realistically, like, where do you see things moving towards? Based on the current like outcome of things and whatever you're experiencing from your perception, because a few times when we do talk about these things around, like, let's just get the right people around the table to discuss like the areas that are missing to build on, or the ways in which we can evolve and get better, like do we need to create like a consortium that enables us to like have a better insight? Do we need to like decentralize information much better in terms of how we're operating, how we're seeing things, to then try to like educate a more kind of like peer network or a wider audience to understand what is it that we're trying to get up to as within players within the space, and then how
Yeah.
does that then move forward. I mean, to kind of like, I guess, give a shout out maybe to more traditional structures, like the UK Law Commission is actually looking at this. I mean, whether it's something they execute or not, but I think the UK being kind of left in silo because it turned its back on the EU and a few other things, is trying to figure out how does it become its own kind of like, well, it's trying to put itself back on the map. And so it's looking at reports of like decentralized autonomous organizations and like demystifying
Yeah.
it, and also then figuring out what are the kind of like UK, England, and Wales, law structures that would enable this thing to grow.
Yeah.
But so traditionally, there's stuff going on internally within Web3. There's stuff going on, and then with all those things kind of amassed, like where is it moving towards realistically in the next couple of years? Would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I fundamentally, it's inevitable that these are the foundations that everything gets built on, and so there's a lot of regulatory machinations that are going on, which goes to nation states battling out for territory as well, and so there's a lot of stuff that's going. So for me, very much, it like back to that idea that of composability of structures and approaches, and so to me, it's like for anything that we're trying to do within a DAO or within the ecosystem is pick the thing that works right now and don't get attached to any one place, jurisdiction, structure, but recognize that it is going to evolve a whole bunch going forward. And so from a regulatory standpoint, yes, there needs to be massive mobilization in the US to help push that, and that's one piece of it. Yes, there needs to be coordination around, or like efforts to maybe not. Like I think the initiatives that go towards pushing regulation are great and well and good. I like where I'm at right now is it's inevitable that we get there. It's similarly is like, what is the amount of pain that we're going to go through in the process of getting there? And I personally am like, I'm not going to invest my energy in trying to wait or trying to move regulatory aspects. I'm all about how do we comply? Like I think about it of bookending. So in everything that I'm approaching things from, it's like, what is the minimum regulatory compliant mechanism using existing tool structures that is easily understood and low friction? And how do we then introduce some of the benefits of the technology within doing that, but it's allowing, like, not push it in a way that slows us down. And then on the other side saying, in about 5 years, we're going to have a really clear path that I think everything will be tokenized, and we're going to be able to execute on things that are fully tokenized and much closer to our ultimate dreams. So let's work on those protocol ideas and start preparing for those things, and then cherry pick them along the way when we can execute. And working in the crypto space, I think right now, I think we have to be thinking about that as a continuum and thinking about that as a roadmap with a lot of uncertainty in between as to when the right time to execute of those, but not put the regulatory, like, just really stay on practical, let's just get shit done now with existing tools and not get too hung up on it.
Yeah. And the picture that comes to mind is one of those like evolutionary trees, or I don't know, Monte Carlo simulations that basically shows that there are many ways to get there. If you know directionally where it's headed, it is almost in your advantage to kind of be agnostic to the how when it comes to the legal, and being aware of like doing things right, but being ready to kind of say, if this jurisdiction or if this policy suddenly enables a new way of governance or whatever it might be, you kind of take what direction the industry or the group that's building within Web3 end up taking it. There's been so many shifts back and forth, especially on the DAO structure of like, is it better in the States? Is it better as a foundation somewhere in Europe? And so these things will play out. But interestingly enough, And you mentioned JavaScript at the beginning. Some of these things depend so much on the virality and the mimetic culture that forms around the solution. So it could actually be
Yes.
the wrong solution going down the wrong path. And as soon as that creates that meme that everyone can resonate with, capital and resources will flow to kind of enable that to be the one that's the winning
Yes.
strand or scenario when thinking about it from the
Yeah.
evolutionary tree. And so we've learned with some pain and some excitement how to navigate the process of like building an organization, whether or not you call it a DAO or an organization, but like a group of people coming together that's putting in their heartbeats into something and making something work, while being very aware that some of these things will kind of evolve away and we need to reconstruct this modular vehicle that we've built to get us on the road to fixing this problem. So how do you see, from a meme point of view, from a virality point of view, how do you play into how communities come together through almost like the flock of birds that move around as murmurations? Like how do you consider this mimetic form that we create as humans, and how do you play it in your advantage or open yourself up to that being the thing that pushes it over the edge?
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. Right, it's like there's actually brings up another piece for me, is that particularly in tech, there's the super strong hyper rationalization world, which makes sense around technology, makes sense around very binary, discrete things. But the way anything actually gets implemented, the way decisions get made, are not about the rational. They're not ultimately about the rational. They're much more influenced by culture, by the resonance of something. And that adds all kinds of variability into how things happen. And meming is a great example. Using memes is a great example of intentionally trying to push those things forward. They're going to be increasingly important, I think, and not in memes the way that we understand them now, but understanding how things resonate with people and allowing those micro messages to start carrying across networks between people is really important, right? Going back to that Uncle John story where he talks about is people want to belong, right? They want to be less lonely. That's what this is all. This is like memes are a vehicle for connection, for us feeling a part of something. And I think that's the right framing. Like we just did something around writing about how to describe. So in venture, that people are talking, is it a vitamin or is it a painkiller? And right, like I'm like, who cares? It's a virus. Like what we want is viruses. That's what we're trying to build. If we're not building a virus that's going to infect everything in the scope of the sector or system that we care about, then we're missing it. Like we're not understanding what we need to be building. Right? It's like, yeah, go ahead and build a piece, but if we're depending on a system transitioning, we have like, better to be a virus, better to be out in everything and connected to everything. And that gets us to starting to think about interoperability, think about the minimum components, think about the way that we can spread and the way that we can build better foundations for whatever is ahead of us. And memes are great because they honor humans, they honor people, they honor what we like, how we feel and think, and the soft squishy side of us.
Yeah, and on that note as well, it's interesting how with the recent call that we had about a week ago, how we've gone through this like idea maze of like like how you mentioned, like obviously from a crowd view standpoint, like going through it from like, hey guys, actually the real problem is supply chains and how we need to give like the basic needs to everyone and also make sure that they're somehow monetizing off of their like work, right? And somehow that just never landed because that storytelling, like you said, it was too heavy to deconstruct into like a bite-sized chunk of understanding that resonates with people, right? Even though they do like inadvertently feel it, when now their like post doesn't get delivered in time or certain things are not in their supermarket, of course you're going to start feeling it. But now like for, I don't know, 9 months later, going into kind of a lot more understanding of that clearly there are these subcultures, which every one of us here is also within. And it's a resonance towards a how to just utilize that culture to just make it relatable to then increase that level of like peer network in a sense, which is, yeah, an interesting.
There's
Yeah,
something really interesting, like you're enabling, like back to the packer, the packer, like having a little certificate says that
right.
I'm a part of this. In a way, that's what you're doing, like with these totally mini subcultures. I see who contribute, like who's a part of it, like from the primitive side, from the actual product side, from every, and it's like, oh, I can be a part of it too, right? By buying it, I'm a part of those people, that creative artist that contributed to that factory and that where, like, it's a really good way. Like it feels like that's what I feel when I hadn't thought about it that way before, but that's what exposing like that infrastructure, exposing that allows me to do, allows me to feel more part of it, and allows me to connect with it in more interesting ways and explore what else did this creator do, what else did this factory produce, where else did this product show up, and maybe that's how I want to start participating. Then maybe I'm forking it and doing something with it. Like that's this path of infecting, of like giving pathways for us to follow. And maybe that's part of what memes are really doing too, is they lead us down rabbit holes. They lead us into different areas that we might not have considered before.
Exactly. And it's like striking that curiosity, right? Because that's the other thing. Because I think right, it's that deep within sensation that comes up when there is that kind of curiosity struck
Yep.
in someone.
Yep.
Because really, I think in conversations that you have with a lot of
Yes.
Web3 people is you could talk about literally anything. And all of those things could be
Yeah.
areas of solving an issue or just making it better in some other way. So that
Yeah.
curiosity has definitely been like, and that word
Yeah.
of mouth as well, because I think that's why you do see a lot of growth or potential scalability and moving away from those. I mean, certain metrics are required for like maybe tracking and to see how you're performing. Regardless, we'll probably have metrics, but that word of mouth organic growth is going to be the most powerful metric to try and
Yeah.
track.
Yeah. Yeah. And so this
We could go
is a
for
whole
hours.
tangent, whole other tangent. But let me just go here. I don't know where this is gonna go, but like on that, you're getting at like, what signal are we drawing on when something is working, or what's a good outcome? And it's so hard to capture those things, especially like as we're talking about with memes. Like it's speaking to something deeper. Fandom is speaking to something deeper. Everything that matters speaks to something deeper. I'd done in 2017 when I first kind of got into the crypto stuff. What took me in deep was some work I was doing around well-being and trying to figure out how to build a platform and protocol that could incentivize individual and collective well-being. And it really drove me deep into, well, how do we measure? Like, how do we know if something is improving well-being? And I did find like there's this World Health Organization quality of life survey that's been like really well tested and measured in countries and cultures around the world to ensure that it's valid. And you can get these basic measures of quality of life by taking these simple surveys. And what struck me about that, so like I designed the protocol to be able to actually take that data and to be able to use that data and inference around the different behaviors and actions to be able to determine what actually might be increasing value and what might increase value across those dimensions for any individual in any in sort of time. And so what I wonder about is like, that's a very meta level. So anything could really be brought back into testing. Is it actually improving people's quality of life? And so but designing a product, like, we're trying to track very specific measurable metrics that we control individually. And that means we can't track longer term outcomes. That means we can't, or like we don't have access to know whether this thing is going to produce longer term outcomes. We don't have access to know how is it moving and influencing a person. We always come back on what is the one metric that tells me this thing is working, not whether it's actually beneficial truly to the people or the system around us. And we're trying always to say an impact anyway, like how do we measure, and how do we measure to ensure that the benefits accrue? I'd like, maybe this opportunity is like, it's more abstract. It's like we need to find a way to get to a broader measure of vitality in a system, of vitality of humans as part of an ecology, than to try and lock it down into those individual things, like as a way to try and capture, is this useful? Is this thing useful? Is this thing valuable? And I think for me, part of why I struggle with metrics is every time we try and get to metrics, we both found down things to that are at the early stage is not helpful or a distraction, because they're not getting us insights into, is this actually going to produce the end state that we're trying to achieve? And so I kind of am wondering, like, yeah, I'm kind of wondering what
but the end state of it could be that there is, I know this sounds a little bit hippie, but it could be a higher conscious level, right? Which it totally is.
No,
that's
but
exactly
that's exactly right.
Like, it's just basically
totally
that
is.
Because it actually made me, what you were just saying reminded me of like, have you watched the Jonah Hill documentary about his therapist called Stutz on Netflix? Okay, you have to watch that. It is very good.
No.
So Jonah Hill is obviously a legendary dude, and he's gone through a lot of things in his life. And so he actually decided to open source his therapy session with his therapist for the past, I don't know, decade, let's say, throughout his obviously life in acting and etc. And his therapist, and the reason probably why he decided to publicize this was because the therapist actually gave really tangible and easy toolkits for anyone to use. I mean, every single session for him must have cost a fortune, but the fact that they just opened this up, those toolkits, which would like lead to you becoming more healthier in your own body and then in your own mind and how you are with other people, is naturally going to just make everyone go higher if they get interested in that. And I think it's interesting to see how in media, like these very mainstream streaming services are now introducing certain like films and videos that are actually trying to like make the conscious a little bit higher, because I think we all kind of feel that there is something going on and we need the support to try to like elevate ourselves a bit.
Yeah. And that goes back to like, what are the ways to get people to find the thing that works for them? Right. Like, and because I think the end state is the same the end state is the same on these journeys for everybody, is like, we call it enlightenment, call it whatever, where it is. And I think spirituality ends up playing a huge role, not in the spiritual, like true sense of that, ends up right in the core of this stuff that we're building. I'll go back to another thing that pointed me at this early on was, a lot of what we're like from an organizational principle standpoint goes back to the research in the 70s around cybernetics, right? Like that still it was like way ahead of its time in terms of not able to implement, but the thinking was totally grounded in actual systems, nature systems, human systems, really understanding the principles of it. And there's one of the Stafford Beer, who came up with the viable system model, which is probably still one of the best frameworks for understanding organizational systems generally. In his book Heart of Enterprise, like where he walks through the whole system, he rationalizes his way down to the end state of, and he always described talked about a person as a manager in the system, right? So talked about managers because he was very using the language of conventional organizations at the time. The ultimate job of a manager is to know themselves. It's that's the sole objective of a manager, is to actually know themselves. And it goes right back to the same thing, right? All this other stuff is we're just it's all of this is just seeking towards understanding and knowing ourselves and this is not right, but our place in everything else. It's finding our place in everything else, belonging naturally without effort in the ultimate everything.
Love that. And that's it.
That's the job
we gotta do. And the two thoughts that pop up, and we'll try to keep this short because we are almost hitting the 1 hour and a half mark. But when you combine the metric side of things and you start considering the different forms of value across intellectual, spiritual, social, the things that kind of stack up to get us through the hierarchy of needs into this higher level of consciousness, it is also important to realize, while you can always measure it and kind of have a feedback loop that helps steer and coordinate based on those metrics, kind of interventions that might help create more value and basically not destroy as much value as what we're doing at the moment. And maybe not destroying, but extracting and putting it into the wrong organizations, maybe. When you think of that, and it does become this, again, back to coordination, and combining it with a little sprinkle of community, where we say the grassroots movement that are doing this metric measurement because they're on the ground and they know exactly how they're feeling in that moment, and being able to fund those grassroots movements is one of the key unlocks here. And we're seeing that in Portugal, actually, where interesting to see how many cultural and music or any kind of association that has formed, and it's all grassroots, and government tries to fund that. And of course, there's other things that we need to solve. But at the end of the day, DAOs enable this, but you're also seeing this even in traditional systems, where at the end of it, the thing that tracks the best in terms of how the system is creating value and what's the health of that system to be able to achieve that higher level of consciousness, it is just give it to the community that is feeling the pain and needs to have the knowledge and decision-making power to be able to steer this ship in the right direction. I think we're optimistic. We're about to, maybe some alpha leak, we're about to drop this Renaissance article that kind of helps with our rebranding, but also pushes forward some of the ideas that we've been excited about around, once you kind of build these better systems, we are going to move into this creator-centric world where we're just building cool shit and allocating funds at the grassroots problem that we want to solve for our community. This is the vision that I think we all share, but maybe in concluding words, or at least in the direction of concluding with some additional questions, how do you see this vision kind of panning out? What things should the audience, the listeners, and we're actually growing in numbers, so we can actually say the listeners now in the pod, what kind of advice or insight would you share about getting us to this shared vision? And what should we look out for along the way so we don't create the next dragons of our time because someone along the way gets too power hungry and fucks it all up?
Be kind, have fun, and turn it over to the people. That's everything. Let's just keep turning it over to the people.
At the end of the day, it all comes down to people, man. It all comes down to people. Saying that, dude, love you so much. You're just the best human being, and we're just so grateful to be able to share this journey with you.
Likewise, love you both. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for being you, and
Thank you.
Having fun in this world.
Thanks, Michael. Talk soon. Take care.